Hi, everyone. Thank you guys so much for coming to our Rutgers Race and Law Annual Symposium. My name is Tamara Anai, and along with Deepta Janahardan, we are the co-editors-in-chief of the Race and Law Review. For those who are unfamiliar with our journal is intended to be a forum for discussion of legal issues as they relate to race. We work with legal scholars and students work together to address race issues in the context of law. The race frequently resurfaces as a big issue in the judicial system, although we found that the legal journals kind of inadequately represent this phenomenon, and that's why a Race and Law Review is intended to kind of fill this void. Our co-dean, Dean Lopez, David Lopez, wanted to be with us here today, but he was unable to do so since he's out of town, so he gave us a little speech that he wanted to read with all of you today. Let me congratulate the Race and Law Review for this year's timely and important symposium, Casting Terror, the Intersection of Race and Security Law in a Post-9/11 World. My apologies for being unable to attend, as I had pre-existing duty obligation out of town. This year's symposium will focus on a topic that is both important and personal to me. Earlier in my career, I tried to a jury 2 cases involving Muslim employees subject to discrimination in the days following September 11th. One case involved a Moroccan Muslim man who had been denied a promotion and effectively fired because of his religion and national origin. The evidence in the case included a comment by his boss that Muslims should be wiped off the face of the earth. The other case involved a Muslim woman who was fired by a lawnmower rental car because she sought to wear a hijab in observation of her Islamic faith in the workplace during Ramadan. Both cases illustrate the discriminatory backlash against Muslims in the United States following September 11, as our neighbors were sometimes treated with suspicion and scorn. However, both cases resulted in Arizona juries, regarded as being fairly conservative, vindicating the rights of the plaintiffs and awarding significant damages, including punitive damages. These jury verdicts have always illustrated to me a deep potential for ordinary Americans to overcome bias and do right. Today's symposium allows us to benefit of time to examine closely in an academic setting the role of race, religion, and national security. As we have seen by President Trump's so-called Muslim ban, these issues remain timely and critical. The Race and Law Journal should be commended for its efforts to bring these critical issues to the Rutgers law community. Best wishes on today's conferences. We want to thank Dean Lopez for his praise and for a nice introduction to our topic. So first we'll be joined by a panel entitled Refugees Without Refuge, and kind of turning refugees into terrorists. We will then hear from the Honorable Dorothy Harbeck, who will share a brief lecture about the U.S. immigration system and U.S. immigration courts. Next, we will serve lunch and also hear from our keynote speaker, Ms. Faiza Patel, who is the co-director of the Brennan Center Liberty and National Security Program. And lastly, we'll be joined by a second panel of experts to discuss the face of national security and how U.S. national and global security concerns intersect with race. We look forward to a very insightful and educational day with you all, and we now begin with our first panel.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rose Cuizan Villazor. I'm a professor of law here at Rutgers Law School and the director of the Center for Immigration Law Policy and Justice. I am honored to moderate this panel on refugees without refuge, turning refugees into terrorists. The overall goal of the panel is to talk about the ways in which migrants from predominantly Muslim countries have been cast as terrorists. And I understand that the title of this symposium is Post 9/11 World. It's been almost 18 years since 9/11 has happened. And so we've been talking about post 9/11 for nearly 2 decades now, and those issues have become even more significant. The issues with respect to how Muslims and Muslim Americans have been treated since 9/11 have been much more pronounced since November 2016. So through the discussions today, we will see much more in depth the ways in which migrants have been cast as terrorists. So with us today are 3 important speakers in this area. Let me just briefly introduce each of them. And their full bios are in the program, so I will highlight just a few key points about their background. So first is Anwen Hughes. She helps to oversee Human Rights First pro bono representation program for indigent asylum seekers. Ms. Hughes provides training and support to volunteers from law firms in New York and New Jersey, who then represent asylum seekers through their program and assist the human rights first local and national advocacy on asylum issues. Next is Elizabeth Feudel, who is IRAP's policy counsel. While she was in law school, she spent a term with the International Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Clinic, in which she conducted primary research on violations of the laws of armed conflict and developed trainings around human trafficking. And then finally, we have Professor Anjum Gupta, who is a director of the Immigrant Rights Clinic here at Rutgers Law School and also teaches non-clinical courses in refugee law and professional responsibility. Professor Gupta writes in the areas of refugee law, and her articles have appeared in many leading journals, including Indiana Law Journal, Colorado Law Review, Georgetown Immigration Law Journal, and Columbia Human Rights Law Review. Here at Rutgers, she directs the Immigrant Rights Clinic, which supervises what students representing immigrants seeking various forms of relief before immigration courts, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Board of Immigration Appeals. Please join me in welcoming our speakers this morning. So just to get us started, if you could just speak briefly about each of your work as it relates to refugee law, particularly in the context of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities.
Everyone's looking at me. Okay, so I guess I'll start. So as Rose mentioned, I direct the Immigrant Rights Clinic here at the law school. I also teach outside the law school and write, but part of my job, and I would say a big part of my job, right, is to direct the Immigrant Rights Clinic, in which students represent clients, and I supervise them in doing so. Can everyone hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. Our clinic focuses on humanitarian forms of immigration relief, and so a big part of what we do is represent refugees who are seeking asylum in the United States. We also represent people who are victims of trafficking or victims of domestic violence or, other kinds of harms. But I would say the vast majority of our cases involve asylum cases. We don't necessarily just focus on refugees from, Arab countries or Muslim refugees, but certainly we have represented Muslim refugees. So just to, I don't know how familiar people are who are in the audience with, asylum law or refugee law, but just, very briefly, when I say we represent refugees who are seeking asylum, in order to get asylum in the United States, if you're a refugee, you have to show that you were persecuted or fear persecution if you were to be sent back on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And that persecution can happen either at the hands of your government or forces that the government is unwilling or unable to control. And so, again, we represent asylum seekers from all over the world, and some of our claims have to do with religion, some of them don't. We have a lot of political opinion-based claims. Claims based on fear of domestic violence or gang violence or other types of violence that doesn't necessarily happen at the hands of state actors, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit more later. But we have, like I said, represented either many Muslims or people from Muslim majority countries, right? So, for example, we've represented people from Chad, Egypt, Sudan, Guinea, Algeria, Nigeria, and a few other countries that I'm sure I'm not remembering off the top of my head. And some of those cases do involve religious-based persecution. And then some of them, so sometimes it's persecution on account of the applicant's religion, right? They're being persecuted because of their religious beliefs. Sometimes it's persecution because of the persecutor's religious beliefs, right? So if we, for example, have an applicant who is gay and who's being persecuted by either family members or, society or whatever, because of potentially religious beliefs about sexuality, right? So, there's definitely been sort of both sides of that. And yeah, I think that's about it in terms of just an overview of the work that we do.
Thank you.
Sure. So I work for the International Refugee Assistance Project, and does everyone hear me okay? Although we're headquartered in New York, we also have offices in Beirut, Lebanon, and Amman, Jordan. And we provide legal aid to individuals who are somewhere in the process of seeking safety through a legal pathway. I say legal in the sense of a particular visa or non-visa kind of route to get somewhere, not in a normative way. And we provide this. It's primarily to individuals who are somewhere in a refugee resettlement process, family reunification, other types of visa or immigrant pathway that are available to people who've been displaced and are seeking safety. I think the distinction may be between my work and their work is that in the United States, we have this interesting kind of bifurcation of the legal system for people who, although they all are refugees under the international legal definition, are either inside the country already or at the borders of the country, or still outside of the country. So if you are already in the United States, or you've just arrived at, say, the southern border or an airport, and you haven't officially entered the country yet, you would be claiming asylum. We would call you in the domestic legal system an asylum seeker. If you are still, say, you fled from Syria and you're still in Lebanon, you would be considered sort of a refugee under the U.S. legal system, potentially going through resettlement. So we work to provide legal aid to primarily those individuals who have not yet arrived in the United States or at U.S. borders. Our kind of origins, initially we were the Iraqi Refugee Assistance Project. Our director had, in law school, about 10 years ago now, she was doing an internship in the Middle East, quickly realized there wasn't quite as much to do as she'd anticipated at the organization she was at, and started traveling around and just sort of poking around as she does, and realized pretty quickly that one of the biggest needs that people had, beyond kind of the subsistence needs that they were articulating, was a need for legal assistance, because immigration law, especially U.S. immigration law, is pretty Byzantine, and it can be confusing to people who are native English speakers with a U.S. law degree. So can be unfathomably difficult for people who have a huge variety of backgrounds, linguistically, educationally. And so she went back to law school that year after her summer internship and founded the Iraqi Refugee Assistance Project, which in the late 2000s was particularly geared at helping people who were being displaced as a consequence of the United States' involvement in Iraq. Since then, we've obviously expanded. Fortunately, we could keep the acronym and change the I in our name to international. But because of where we started, we still have a client base that is very heavily Middle Eastern, North African, and some South Asian. It's definitely expanding. We have these days a lot more Central American clients, Sub-Saharan African clients, Asian, some from Chechnya, Eastern Europe, and it's definitely broadening. But where we come from is a place where we were, where we started. We were representing primarily Middle Eastern asylum seekers, or North African asylum seekers, and today I think that's still the bulk of our clients. And so over the past couple of years, we've seen up close, very seriously, the consequences of an Islamophobia that's growing and becoming more and more explicit in our legal aid casework, and then also in the impact litigation and the policy advocacy that we conduct on systemic issues that emanate from that casework. Most of our clients are U.S. bound. We do have some that we resettle or help with other types of visas or pathways to other countries, but majority U.S. bound. So, the variety of things that we're seeing in the immigration legal landscape that have been heavily influenced by Islamophobia, sentiments about, the Middle East, has impacted our clients, greatly, whether that's, at some stages banning them from the country, reducing refugee resettlement to a point where almost no one's getting in, leaving people stuck in processing for years, leaving families separated. So I will leave it there and turn it over to Anwen.
I work for Human Rights First. I work in our refugee representation program, which aims to provide people with free legal representation in the domestic side of the U.S. refugee processing scheme. So that's people who have arrived in the U.S. on their own steam by some means or other, and are seeking to get themselves recognized as refugees by the United States government from within the country. I also have a foot in our advocacy work on refugee issues, which has dealt with the asylum system domestically, and also over time with the international refugee processing system. We've been doing this since 1978, which is rather a long time. I've been with the organization since 1999, so I vividly remember what things were before the 9/11 era that we talk about so much. And I guess, as far as our representation work is concerned, the program I work for seeks to represent asylum seekers in the greater New York area and in other areas of the country where we have offices who don't have enough money for competent private counsel. Now, in New York City, that describes a very diverse group of people. And so, we have the full range of nationalities, ethnic origins, religions, and so on. That said, we do have, and we have historically had, a large proportion of our client base who are Muslim and or Arab and or South Asian. And so, we've definitely had a lot of firsthand experience with how those communities have been treated in the system over the past 20 or so years. What else can I say about this? I think that our organization also historically has done a fair amount of work on U.S. law and security issues. So there's been a fair amount of overlap with detention schemes in our domestic asylum work. Detention of asylum seekers has been a huge advocacy issue of ours for a long time. And I personally have also, in the organization more broadly, we've also done a lot of work on the terrorism bars, so-called, in the Immigration and Nationality Act, which had actually existed in the Act for a very long time, but gained major steam with the passage of the USA Patriot Act. And I get no joy from having been historically correct, but I remember working on the predecessor bills to the USA Patriot Act. And I know most of us, by virtue of being at this panel, are probably not huge cheerleaders for the USA Patriot Act, but I will tell you that the predecessor bills to that legislation really took the paint off the walls from a rule of law standpoint. So. But I remember at the time writing all these memos for Congress, colleagues in D.C. and anyone who was willing to listen about how the terrorism-related provisions of this proposed legislation were likely to produce a parade of horribles, which I remember describing in some detail. And all I can say is that since that time, the horribles have definitely been parading, and we've been, trying to mitigate the effects of that. So I guess that's it in a nutshell.
Great, thank you. Now I'd like for us to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the cases that you work on. So I'll start with you, Anju. Through the work that you do with the Immigrant Rights Clinic, in particular with respect to the new administration, how have you seen, what kind of changes did you see before 2016 and after?
Okay, so that's a big question, so feel free to cut me off if I'm talking too long, because there are so many, changes. Starting with immediately after inauguration, I think one of the first things that the president did was the travel ban, to institute the travel ban. And so, we had even Rutgers students who were trapped abroad, literally, and not allowed back in the country. And so that was something that impacted our work, right away. And so we were asked by the administration to kind of provide guidance to those students and help get people back in. And so, that was something that impacted our work, but also impacted the communities really that we're talking about today. As we know, at least the initial travel ban, but certainly even its the subsequent versions of the travel ban have largely targeted individuals from Muslim countries or Muslim majority countries. And then another big issue that we all heard about, right, during this administration was sort of the zero tolerance policies at the border and the separation of kids from their parents, right? That was obviously something that came to a head last summer, but I will say that there are still kids who are separated from their families to this day, that was happening, even before it really became big in the news. But that is something that we were called upon to work on last summer in particular as well, and we still have a project now. We have a staff attorney. Some of you may have met her, Samantha Rumsey, who's amazing, who works with kids, right? So immigrant kids and adults with kids, and has worked on that issue as well. Just a word on that if people didn't really realize why that was happening. So I don't know if you remember, but at the time the president kept saying something like, it's because of the Democrats' policies that we're being forced to separate these kids from their parents, right? Does that sound familiar? Mm-hmm. And everyone was like, what is he talking about? And what he was talking about was, there was this settlement in place that made it so that the government couldn't just indefinitely detain children, right? Which makes sense. There are a lot of proven harms that result to kids from being put in detention, in prison, really. So the issue was that they couldn't just detain families together because they weren't allowed to just indefinitely detain kids. And so they said, well, if you're not going to let us detain kids, then we're going to have to separate the kids from their parents so we can detain the parents, was really what was going on, right? And so, that's something that, so we were last summer going into detention centers and interviewing kids about the conditions of their detention, and really trying to make sure that there were efforts being made to reunify them with either their parents or whomever they were separated from when they came across the border, or any other adult that could, many of them have family members who are in the United States and who are not detained, whom they could be reunified with, and that really wasn't happening very quickly. Still is to this day, not really happening as quickly as it could be. So that was certainly another issue. The controversy surrounding the wall, as we know, led to this government shutdown that happened this past year. And even that impacted our work in many ways. So, when the government was shut down, that meant that some agencies, federal agencies, like the immigration agencies, the Board of Immigration Appeals, the immigration courts, were operating on a much more limited basis. And so we all, sure had cases that were before the courts or before the Board of Immigration Appeals, and during that time, in either the hearing would be canceled and rescheduled for like 2 or 3 years down the line, or we had cases that were pending before the Board of Immigration Appeals that we expected to get extensions of time on for our briefs, and they weren't adjudicating motions. So during that however many week period of the government shutdown, we could file motions for extension of time, but they weren't adjudicating them. But that meant that we had to file our briefs according to the original schedule, even though no one was going to be there to read the briefs. Things like that, which ultimately just had a very difficult impact on our work, and of course on our clients. I would say another big thing is just increased enforcement overall, right? So. Oh, you want me to stop? Okay, so I'll wrap up. Thank you. Yeah, so I would say, before the Trump administration, there had been, in theory at least, the idea was to prioritize immigrants that had, serious criminal backgrounds or criminal histories or whatever, and that has kind of gone out the window, and now it's like enforcement all over the place, just detaining detaining people. So we've started a detention project to address, to try to provide representation to people who are detained. I have a whole bunch of other ones, but maybe next time around I can
Yeah.
some of those in.
No, and you're right. That question, how the clinic work has changed, certainly goes beyond just the work that relates to the specific topic of Islamophobia, right? But it is important, I think, for you to connect the ways in which Muslim non-citizens and their families have been treated with the wall, with detention policies, with heightened enforcement. They're all wrapped up together, that stemming from a particular vision that this administration has with respect to how to treat non-citizens. But let's kind of move a little bit much more closer to the focus of this panel, and that is how Islamophobia has shaped immigration policy. So, Elizabeth, you started talking earlier already, alluded to the work that you do with IRAP and how those specific policies that are targeted against Muslim non-citizens and their families have changed the legal landscape. Can you just talk and highlight a few, provide some highlights from your current work about that area?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it affects different areas of our work in different ways. One major thing, which I mentioned earlier, is that we have, for a lot of our client base, either much longer wait times or fewer options available. So in 2016, every year I should say that the president, after consulting Congress, sets an annual number of refugees that are going to be admitted for that year. It's called the presidential determination, usually comes out in September or October. In 2016, before Obama left office, it was set to be 110,000 for the upcoming fiscal year. And part of the initial executive orders instituting the Muslim ban was to radically slash that. And for the past couple of years, for 2017 and 2018, we've seen not only drastically reduced presidential determination numbers of refugees to be resettled, but also an extreme slowdown in processing such that not even those drastically reduced numbers are being met. So for instance, this year and the past year, the number was set to 30,000. And, from which you can see from 110,000, quite a difference. We're talking about historical lows in the history of the refugee resettlement program. And not even that number is being met because arrivals have come to a trickle. So I think one thing has been, from a legal aid standpoint, trying to find alternatives for our clients. Less than 1% of refugees in the world are ever actually resettled. So you're talking about the most vulnerable of a very vulnerable population. And some of our clients just cannot wait in the situations they're in. It's life or death, even sometimes in the place that they fled to. And so looking for alternatives for them, whether that's family reunification, if they have family somewhere, looking at other countries that do refugee resettlement, humanitarian visas, other types of programs. So I think our legal aid work has had to kind of scrounge for alternatives for those people. Looking at it from a more systemic level, traditionally refugee resettlement was a much less politicized and partisan issue. The refugee program under Ronald Reagan, for instance, was quite robust. Certainly not perfect, but quite robust. And even under George W. Bush, we had many more refugees coming into the country in general. And traditionally, it was somewhat walled off from larger debates about immigration. It was just seen as a less politicized issue. And over the past 3 years, we've seen quite a serious erosion of that distinction. And that's created an environment in which it can be much more difficult to advocate on these issues. In some ways, there are opportunities there. I think that over the past couple of years, we've seen, kind of hand in hand with the erosion of that distinction, we've also seen, areas of immigration law and immigration policy that were previously walled off from each other, are now coming together. I think there's a lot more collaboration, cross-pollination between groups that do different kinds of immigration work, and I think that has been really positive. But at the same time, it's still been incredibly difficult to affect policy change. When you're kind of unable to maintain the same level of across the aisle relationships that you were previously. And so I think, that's led for our organization to kind of a real expansion of litigation. We'd, I think, had a few lawsuits prior to the Muslim ban, but once that hit in 2017, we were having trouble getting the same kind of traction with our policy work that we used to be able to. And out of that, came an entire kind of litigation team to litigate a number of issues. I think the Muslim ban is, the biggest and most well-known one, but also, a number of other issues in which we wanted to kind of contribute the expertise we'd built up through our casework. So things like the deportation of asylum seekers, who'd been granted asylum or been resettled as refugees, decades ago, and the administration is now trying to deport back to Iraq or Somalia, based on decades-old criminal convictions, often for pretty minor crimes. And so, in order to kind of combat what we're seeing in the environment now, particularly in relation to our Muslim or Arab clients, we've had to turn to litigation as kind of another tool, which is something that we weren't doing as traditionally. So I think those are some of the ways in which it's changed.
It's a lot. I mean, we're seeing here, I think you're all hearing a trend here of since 9/11, the practice of refugee and asylum law has already changed, and then even more so in the last couple years. And so I'd like to ask the panelists to start thinking about what might be what's the light at the end of the tunnel, if any, because while we need to be realistic in terms of how we describe the work that all of us are doing, it's also, I think, important for us to think about what are some lessons for the future, and is there some positive, is there something positive that it might emerge from all of this work? But with respect to the work that you do, Anwen, with human rights, you mentioned earlier the USA Patriot Act and anti-terrorism provisions of the INA. It strikes me from what I heard you say that there has been an increased use of that in the last few years. And if that's the case, can you talk a little bit about that? What were the legal claims or legal challenges that you've presented against the government's use of those anti-terrorism provisions?
So, there has been an increase in the last few years. If by the last few years you mean like the last 15 or so. So this is not a problem that dates to the Trump administration. The Immigration Nationality Act has, since 1990, included an extremely broad definition of what it means when it talks about terrorist activity. I think that there's, as many of you probably know, there's no generally accepted international definition of terrorism. And I think that when most of us use that term, I mean, it's a heavily loaded term, right? That's its whole point. But I think when most of us use that term, we usually have in our heads some thought about violence that's illegitimate in terms of its targets and in terms of its purposes. And the INA does not include limitations with respect to either of those terms significantly. And so currently, subsequent to the broadening of that underlying definition of terrorist activity, that has not been broadened that much over time. It used to refer to the use of a firearm, and now it refers to any other dangerous device. But frankly, I mean, that's not an enormous broadening. The underlying definition has referred to the use of a weapon or any other dangerous device for purpose in order to endanger the safety of persons or cause substantial damage to property, full stop. That's a really broad definition whose breadth went largely unnoticed until the passage of the USA Patriot Act. What happened with the USA Patriot Act was really two things. One, that the Act incorporated a three-part definition of what would be considered a terrorist organization for purposes of the INA, to include not only the groups that are on the State Department's list that they maintain, the old Tier 1 or designated foreign terrorist organization list, which is the list most of us think of and that you can look up online, a list that could be known as the Terrorist Exclusion List, which was also a creation of the 2001 law of the Patriot Act, that is, and also a third mushy category, which defines a terrorist organization to mean any group of two or more persons, whether organized or not, that engages in, and post-passage of the Real ID Act in 2005, it also now says, or has a subgroup that engages in terrorist activity as very broadly defined under the Act. Now, this is a definition of stunning breadth, as many courts have commented, including the Board of Immigration Appeals, and there you have it. And so this began to wreak very major havoc because the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services was really the first sub-agency in the U.S. immigration sphere to start taking this definition both seriously and extremely literally. And so they suddenly started categorizing as terrorist organizations a whole wide range of collections of humanity, association with which had often been the basis for a person to be granted asylum, and which certainly had never seen as being a basis for denial. And I would say, I mean, we're talking here about Islamophobia, and I'm going to talk a lot more about Islamophobia in a second, but I would say that these particular definitions and the impact that they have been a marvel of non-discriminatory ecumenicism, in the sense that, I've had clients from all conceivable religions, genders, age groups affected by this thing. I think my youngest terrorist client was 7, a very well-behaved second grader.
I had one that was 3.
Huh?
I had one that was 3.
Yeah. And the funny thing was, he was the only member of the family affected by this. The parents had both been granted their green cards, and they produced this little child. He was like playing Legos during our. It was horrible.
Wait, what did he do that he got cast as engaging in terrorist activity?
He was born, basically. I mean, that is to say, there's a provision in the Act that says that if you are the spouse or child of a person who's inadmissible under these provisions, then you are inadmissible under these provisions. And so somebody had misread the acronym of the Burmese dissident group that the father had been associated with as the acronym of a different Burmese group, which they considered to be posing terrorism issues, Tier 3 terrorism issues at that time. And so, having previously approved the paperwork of the parents, they had decided that this 7-year-old was a manifest threat to public order. I've had 74-year-old ladies. I mean, the list goes on and on. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Swedish Lutherans. I mean, the Swedish Lutherans were really Ethiopian, but in any event, it's been very diverse. That said, I think that a lot of the difficulties in ratcheting back this craziness, which was, in fairness, acknowledged to be crazy from, I would say, a couple years into the discovery of this problem under the second Bush administration. There became to be a realization that, okay, this isn't right, and something needs to be done about it. So I think that part of the difficulty of ratcheting it back, I will in just a second, has been that I think that the term terrorism has come to be so associated in the public mind with certain particular forms of illegitimate violence, and that when you try to rein in manifestly overbroad legislation that you passed, you run into the assumption that this is going to be letting in all of these people that we're afraid of, who tend to be people of a particular type. I think the difference some things that have been distinct in this area under the Trump administration are, first of all, these dynamics have created major problems in resulting in a lot of cases getting held up for an incredibly long time, and under Bush and under Obama, this was understood to be a problem that affected whatever applications they had pending at that moment. So you had people who'd been previously granted asylum or refugee status who now were suddenly unable to get their green cards because those were seen as posing a problem. There had been a clear universal message from the administration under 2 successive administrations that, as far as they were concerned, this was a problem with respect to those green cards, and that the administration had no interest in going after people's underlying asylum or refugee status. That has now changed. So in the past few weeks, a couple of months, I've been seeing a rash of notices of intent to terminate asylum status, which do not seem to be based on any discernible logic as to why in certain cases they've decided to go after people's underlying status, whereas in others they're just issuing notices of intent to deny the asylum claims. And I think that this I think ties into a very real shift in tone under this administration, which also relates to a shift in substance. I mean, let's be honest, there have not been typically enormous ideological divides between successive U.S. administrations over history, okay? And there have been certain shared assumptions that it was always possible to rely on in advocacy. I'm talking basic assumptions here, like chaos is bad, okay? Cruelty for cruelty's sake should never be the policy of the U.S. government. I feel that some of these things have now been called into question, and it makes, as you're saying about suing rather than talking, it makes for a much more difficult dialogue if you can't rely on those shared assumptions. You know, there had been a shared bipartisan commitment to refugee protection as being a good thing. And I think that in these very brutal decisions that we're seeing made now, you're seeing the result of that and also the frustration of the non-political segments of the government feeling like they just can't hold out any longer in the absence of a solution to these long-lasting problems.
Thank you for reminding us that the problems with the anti-terrorism provisions really predate the Trump administration. There is a big problem within the statute itself. At least from my end, I don't practice law. I do primarily research, legal writing, and policy work. And so, like Elizabeth, now that policy has not seemed to have not working as well, then litigation is perhaps a key. And so it's bothersome that it's hard to engage in a conversation now with people across the political line, because the principle of our international human rights obligation to provide for the United States to be a place of refuge that commitment seems to have gone out the door. So that's the starting place of conversation has become much more difficult. And then also, during the election for the 2016 presidential election, there were a lot of anti-Muslim statements made, right? And those statements were used as evidence during the Trump versus Hawaii, and the majority said they were not enough. And so then what do we do with statements made by the president that says he did not want Muslims to come here? And then the last point, I think, is the media's role here. When, let's say, when a white male engages in what would be considered a terrorist act, perhaps under the statute, but because he's a citizen, the media doesn't cast him as terrorist. And yet, we just had a policy, someone from NYU come here a month ago, distinguishing the difference between how the media treats terrorists and how race and religion plays a factor in that. And so certainly for the media and what people are hearing, there's already this vision of who is a terrorist, and right away there's a particular person in mind. And then when it's someone who does not look, who looks from he or she's from the Middle East, or who's from Arab, then they think, oh, it's just an American who's doing something bad. Right, so these are the different points that shape the way that we talk about the obligation of the United States to comply with both domestic law and international law. That when people come to our border and they seek asylum, they should at least get a fair shake in a credible fear interview, and then the process is supposed to be affordable for them. So there's a lot for us to process, and lots that we've had to process since 9/11. Last 15 years, the last few years. And so I'm just wondering, before we open it up for Q&A, are you seeing any light at the end of the tunnel at all? What's your three very dedicated, passionate advocates in your work? What gets you going? What helps you in doing the work that you're doing?
I will say, I'm not sure if this is a light at the end of the tunnel or a silver lining. Is this
okay, that's something. Yeah.
So, I will say one silver lining is as a result of all of these policies and changes and the backlash, back and forth, there's just a lot more attention being paid to this area, and sometimes with attention also comes money, right? So we're seeing funding like we've never seen. I don't know about you guys, but we're definitely seeing funding like we've never seen before. So like I said, we were able to start this new detention project recently, and that was because last year Governor Murphy put $2.1 million into New Jersey's state budget for the representation of detained immigrants in New Jersey, and the idea is to increase that every year. And so we're very fortunate here at Rutgers to be able to play a part in that, but Legal Services of New Jersey and American Friends Service Committee and Seton Hall are also partners with us. But the idea is to work toward providing universal representation to anyone who is detained in a New Jersey detention center. And there are a lot of people. New Jersey has, given how small a state we are, we have very big detention centers with a lot of people, and a lot of people from New York get shipped over to New Jersey to be detained. And so, that's a positive, right? That people are paying more attention to this, and people are, willing to kind of put their money where their mouth is on that. And I will also say I've been, it's overall, it's definitely been, a demoralizing couple of years, I will say, in this area. Just hard. It's just been hard. It's been, emotionally, physically, and mentally exhausting. But there have been things that I've been heartened by. I mean, the courts, I think, not in all cases, but in many cases, I think the courts have stepped up and seen like, okay, we really need to provide a check on some of these things that are happening, right? So, one of the things I didn't get to talk about last time, but one of the in my area, at least, one of the really bad things that has happened since the election was that Attorney General Jeff Sessions issued a decision vacating a prior decision that said that victims of domestic violence could get asylum protection. And he couldn't say it, right? But basically tried to say that that victims of domestic violence could not be eligible for asylum, and also within that a whole bunch of dicta about how also victims of gang violence and all kinds of violence at the hands of private actors that they would not be eligible for asylum. And late last year, a court in the District Court of D.C. Struck down policies that relate to that decision that were used to deny people from even getting hearings, right? So if someone came in, usually when someone comes in and they say that they're afraid, they undergo a credible fear interview for which the bar is very low, right? It's just like, do they have a fear? Is that fear believable or whatever? And if so, they get a hearing at which they get to present their asylum claim. Well, based on this case, this decision that Jeff Sessions issued, that the USCIS was denying people even at that stage, right? Saying, no, you can't even apply for asylum because your claim is based on domestic violence, or because your claim is based on gang violence. And late last year, in December of 2018, a court in D.C. Struck that down, that practice down, and and basically in doing so attacked this decision that Jeff Sessions had issued. And so that was very heartening, right? And we're seeing that in different places in the country, that courts really are taking very seriously. Whereas in the past, maybe, there is a certain amount of deference that is owed to the immigration agencies, but I think we were kind of seeing more deference than we wanted. But now I think they're taking very seriously their position and their power to kind of put a stop to some of these policies that really are in contravention to our obligations under the Refugee Convention. And so I think that's another silver lining, is we're definitely seeing people step up.
Yeah, thank you.
I think, one of the things that was underlying your answer just there was the degree to which the executive branch of our government has authority over immigration in general, over refugee law and policy, over asylum law and policy. And I think we've learned over the past couple of years the degree to which that can cut both ways. Immigration was certainly not a perfect business under the last administration. We also had a lot of qualms with that one. But I think, there were also a lot of ways in which it worked in our favor when we were going out to do advocacy for our clients, for people similarly situated. And that was because there was this, significant degree of of not just deference, but kind of ability to initiate these policies, everything from the president setting, the number of refugees that was going to be resettled in the United States for the upcoming fiscal year, to the nitty-gritty of the policies governing how those refugees were selected and processed and security screened and brought into the country. And again, that can cut both ways for you. And so over the past couple of years, that power has manifested itself in things like the executive order or Jeff Sessions' matter of AB decision. And I think we'll be much more conscious of that in the future. It also does mean that, although things eventually do go through a court process and there's that check on it, as easy as it has been for the administration to initiate some of these policies over the past couple of years, it can also be easy to reverse them. The damage will be done in a lot of cases. The infrastructure will have been torn down, but an executive order can be rescinded. The presidential determination can be increased, as much as it can be lowered. So I think that there's, also a lot of possibilities, at least, in some of these bigger questions, if we were to get a more refugee and immigrant-friendly administration, regardless of political party, in office the next time around.
So I'm supposed to be finding light at the end of the tunnel. Okay. I think I'd echo everybody else's sentiment that I think as refugee advocates, one silver lining in this situation has been that in the same way that in the past, one tended not to see negative political focus on refugees as refugees specifically. That was something that was a constant dynamic in Europe, but much less here. I think as that has become a political dynamic here and driving a lot of hatred, there's also been a larger counter-reaction to that, which has been heartening to see and has been, I know, a boost to the morale of some of our affected clients, many of whom were genuinely moved, for example, by the broad public demonstrations against the Muslim ban that unfolded in early 2017. At the same time, I think there are a number of dynamics that predated this administration where I'm concerned about their growing permanency. One has been the tendency to see certain refugees from certain countries through a security prism first and as refugees second. This has been so clear in the case of Syrians in particular. Our organization had done a lot of work to try to inject some energy into the notion of Syrian refugee resettlement once it became clear that these people's exile from their country was likely to last much longer than anyone had hoped in the beginning. And at the same time that the U.S. administration, for a brief period, started taking that very seriously, the overwhelming security focus on that population meant that, as Elizabeth and others will know, the process for processing those claims became this completely unwieldy monster. And that's definitely been manifested in the US also. I have nightmares where in my old age, my career is exclusively devoted to data mining issues. I'm not happy about this. I say this everywhere I go. But, I remember in the era of later Obama going in for an affirmative asylum interview. This was supposed to be the kinder, friendlier aspect of the U.S. immigration system for a family of Syrian clients of mine. And the officer's reaction to our arrival, this was somebody who didn't have the traditional filter between brain and mouth that most of us try to maintain, but so it was more overt than usual, was really like, Syrians and tigers and bears, oh my. And I was thinking, what have we done? We're sweet, right? We're all like formally dressed. The kids are in frilly dresses. We're talking like 2 professional parents, 3 kids, one of them U.S. citizen, and me. Good morning to you too, literally there was nothing wrong with this case, but it was just so alienating, getting the sense that from the get-go we were having to rebut some assumption that we were here to cause harm to the country. Now, in terms of lights, because I really am focused on this tunnel and focused on getting us all out of it.
Or the silver lining.
Okay, whatever.
As Angie said.
Another thing that does strike me is a lot of the clients that I represent who fall within the general scope of this symposium are themselves fleeing dynamics in their home country that are heavily tinged with Islamophobia. And I'm talking here about governments whose members are overwhelmingly Muslim. There's been an enormous amount of exploitation of these dynamics in the Middle East and in North Africa The regimes in Syria and Egypt are, I would say, notorious examples of this kind of thing. And so you have people coming here seeking asylum who have already been labeled as terrorists or whose causes have already been labeled as somehow fronts for Islamist extremism by their own governments. And I think it's just maddeningly counterproductive, even in terms of US national security interests, if we start adopting that prism here in our domestic asylum system. Contrary-wise, I would say it's extremely helpful to the rule of law, but also to a whole bunch of policy priorities, which are not really my problem, but which I think should be the problem of the US government, when our legal system says no. Our legal system says, no, we're going to look at you individually, and we're actually going to look at the evidence, right? And we're not necessarily going to buy into this with our eyes closed. And so I think that every time somebody gets a fair decision in this system, after having been subjected to these kinds of accusations or after having fled a situation where nobody was actually interested in listening to the legitimate problems that they had, and they actually get a fair shake in this system, I think that's a victory that goes beyond that particular case, I would say. Another thing that has been very troubling that has also been growing apace is the extent to which some of these same governments and their local supporters, governmental and non, have been clever at sort of directly exploiting the U.S. security apparatus, or trying to at least, in order to harass people here. So, it's a fact, for example, that if you call the FBI and you say, this guy who lives down the street from me looks really sketchy and I'm sure I think he's a child molester, the FBI is going to exercise its professional judgment as to whether they think you're a real crank or they think there might be something to this. If you make the identical call and you say, I've got this neighbor and he's a terrorist, they are mandated to go out and interview your neighbor. And I mean, I say this because I spent more time than I should dealing with these kinds of interview requests. And I think that it is, I think that some US security agencies are more sophisticated than others in understanding that there is that underlying dynamic. But at the same time, I think the fact that terrorism, as it's understood, has been seen as this, by which they tend to mean, not white Middle Western guys who, shoot up mosques, but rather the other phenomena we were talking about earlier, that has that helps create this dynamic which, makes people's lives genuinely difficult.
Thank you. We will soon open it up for Q&A. One of the things that, in terms of whether it's a light at the end of the tunnel or a silver lining, and for me, it's what Andrew and a number of you mentioned. In January 2017, when the Muslim ban the executive order was issued, people flooded the airports, right? And so I was able to volunteer with people who worked at Cadwala there, who in these big firms, who knew nothing about immigration, but they felt this calling to go and show up and be there to interview people who were being detained. We've also seen an increase of states and local governments filing lawsuits against the federal government. They were certainly involved with in challenging the executive order regarding the Muslim ban. So to me, the work that these nonprofit organizations and the clinics are doing are so important. But we've seen a support from many different organizations, and that to me it has been helpful in thinking about that we're all hands on deck, and that we can all do what we can to try to help people using the skills that we're trained to do. So with that, we have about 10 minutes for Q&A, and I'd like to just go ahead and open it up to the audience.
If you have a question, raise your hand now.
Hi, my name is Ibrahim Beshouri. I'm finishing my PhD on the NYPD surveillance program and its impact on Muslim communities. I had questions regarding the way, we know that immigration status or asylum seeking have been used to ask individuals to become informants for the FBI, for the NYPD, etc. And I wanted to know if you, in the cases you're dealing with, if you saw any increase in those practices after Trump election.
I know that for our clients, primarily, again, people who've been resettled, through the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program or similar pathways. It's interesting because they're not claiming asylum when they're here or dealing with their immigration status when they're here. They're not necessarily coming into contact with those agencies as naturally here. But I know that I think it was for the first time starting in 2017 that we would occasionally hear reports from our clients or from resettlement agencies about their clients. That people were just being really randomly approached by the FBI about becoming informants, and were quite shocked and confused about it, especially because some of these people, the persecution they'd experienced had to do with the government in their home country. So, it's especially traumatizing to suddenly have somebody show up and there's an implication that you could be jeopardizing your status in the United States, your ability to be in the United States, if you don't cooperate. And this was the first time we'd ever, heard about this happening with our clients who had been resettled here or people who had been resettled here.
Yeah, this is something that had been happening to asylum applicants for a long time, with certain countries as a particular focus, but not. It happens. It's been an ongoing phenomenon. I don't know if it's necessarily increased. Honestly. But it had been, there had been a lot of this going back years and years, and I'm not sure in terms of people seeking people out to be informants. I'm not sure I'm in a position to say. I'm not sure my own statistical sense has any real statistical meaning, so I'm not sure to what extent it's actually gotten worse.
I'm actually going to ask a question really quick. One thing that I have been interested in knowing more about the research I've done on the Syrian refugee crisis through being a research assistant is I've come across a lot of articles about the very big difficulty of doing asylum-seeking work or refugee work for LGBT plus refugees from countries which might be hostile towards those communities. I guess, do you have any kind of experience working with Muslim refugees who also happen to be LGBT plus, and what are some suggestions about doing that work? What are some things that you all have had to do to ensure their safety, and what are some difficulties?
I just answered the last question, so I'll be brief. But we have a lot of clients who identify as LGBTQ plus, and I think we're always sensitive or trying to be sensitive to particular needs that those clients might have. But I think we, with a lot of our clients, we'll have kind of an extra layer of awareness regarding, a few things. One would be kind of levels of comfort with translators. The same thing happens for, sometimes for clients who've converted to Christianity or another religion, that they might have a sense of discomfort about being on the phone, or on Skype or whatever, with somebody who's also from, their same nationality. And so, that can be a challenge. And I think also making referrals to other service providers, just because, an organization or service provider has experience working with people from, a certain region or a certain nationality, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the appropriate background in working with somebody who's LGBTQ plus and has experienced certain kinds of trauma and probably has certain sensitivity. So I think we try to be very aware of those.
Yeah, we also have a significant number of clients who would fall into those situations. I think in the U.S. when you're doing this, you don't have the other problem of people not being safe in the community within which you're trying to assist them, right? So that's a problem that we don't have, I think, in other respects. Yeah, we see those cases. I don't feel that in a U.S. domestic context they pose particular challenges, to be honest, rather the opposite. I have seen a number of people who had that as a fact of their identity, but whose asylum claims were based on completely other things, and who I think made a deliberate choice not to focus on that other aspect for a variety of privacy reasons, and that's their call. As long as the claim was clearly winnable on the other reasons that had actually prompted their flight from the country, it's really not necessarily my business to,
Hi, my name is Mbalu. I'm a student here, second year at Rutgers Law. So I want to play a little bit the devil advocate. And because I wasn't born in the United States, but based on the things I learned about the history of America, I have the view that, America was, the populist view on immigrant was actually negative, because you have the Irish immigrant being discriminated against. The Mexican are always being discriminated against. And when it was during World War II, you had the Japanese American, again, being discriminated against. And then, you see this dynamic, even with the communist era, you have people, Communist Party being discriminated against. And now, with the whole war on terror, you have the Middle Eastern or Muslim predominant people being discriminated against. So I see this kind of pattern going on. So, hearing people say, well, America is a welcome country, I'm not so sure about it, And also, that's part of my question. Maybe you can address it. And the other one is related to, the second portion is why is America have to accept all the immigrants? You have Saudi Arabia, for example. Why people from Middle Eastern don't go to Saudi? Why isn't Saudi Arabia taking more immigrants, for example? Why isn't South Africa taking more immigrants from Sub-Saharan Africa? Why it has to be America who has to accept all those people and assume all those responsibility? Because you have, for example, some people who are afraid, claiming that those immigrants are taking over the job. They are, all those kind of things. If you can address it.
Can I take some of that?
Yeah.
So I think this country and a lot of other countries that were founded around stated accepted shared principles that are good principles, our history has been, a constant struggle between our principles and our baser natures, right? And I think that all of the instances you cite are certainly true, and I think that when we then look back on those instances of discrimination, we feel historical shame. And I guess all of our goals as advocates is to try to help improve people's eyesight in the present and not rely on hindsight being 20/20. So I don't think those two things are necessarily contradictory. I think all of these impulses are present at the same time, even during those periods in question, and even during this period now. These contrary impulses are present simultaneously, and I think that we're trying to represent the underlying principles and trying to push for the rule of law. As far as U.S. obligations, I think first of all, in the field of refugee protection is something of a, what you call those things on the pressure cooker that keeps it from exploding? The
whistle thing?
The soupape is what you call it in French. I'm sorry, I'm losing it. Anyway, it's that thing, right, on a world of increasing migration controls. And so, the Refugee Convention is something that says to states, whatever else you may be doing in the field of refugee protection, there are going to be these certain recognized exceptions. So I don't think any of us are necessarily arguing for a complete free flow of uncontrolled migration as a policy position. I'm not saying you can't argue for that. I'm just saying I don't think that's what any of us are actually arguing for institutionally. I think also that there's a certain whataboutism that I think is unhelpful in advancing policy debates, to say, well, the U.S. is doing this bad thing, but all these other countries are doing this bad thing also. First of all, we do not normally want to compare our refugee protection record with that of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, as we all know, is a signatory to pretty much nothing relevant to this. It does not grant status to refugees. It takes in tons of migrants, by the way, and treats them quite badly on the whole, with very few security protections. And it's built itself on their labor. So in the same way that the U.S. has historically had very large numbers of migrants and has derived economic benefit from that. So I think it's also an underappreciated fact about global refugee protection that there are an awful lot of countries much poorer than the United States that for decades have been doing the job of refugee protection with varying degrees of efficiency and generosity, but they have, unrecognized, in some cases unbound to this by treaty, and without a lot of fuss and without a lot of recognition. I mean, if you look at West Africa, where there were massive refugee movements, throughout the later 80s and 90s, all of those countries were accepting their neighbors without a lot of question, you know, without a lot of fuss. I mean, if you look at Lebanon, where, I mean, it's a bad environment for Syrian refugees, I don't dispute that, but nonetheless, I mean, you know, things got to a point where, like, 1 in 2 school children in Lebanon in the public schools was a Syrian refugee. Now, partly that's because the Lebanese tend to send their kids to private schools at high rates, but nonetheless, that's a stunning statistic. I mean, you know, what we've been advocating for in the United States in, you know, our wildest demands or urgings has been something statistically completely insignificant in comparison with what other countries do on a daily basis, you know. So I think that's what I would have to say about that.
So I'm afraid we're actually out of time. I want to make sure that we move on to the next panel, but hopefully we can continue thinking about these questions and engaging together in these issues. Before we do, please join me in thanking our panelists for being here today.
Thank you.
Good morning.